Today I'm going to show you how to photograph and stitch together astrophotography panoramas. A panorama is basically a photograph with a long, thin aspect ratio. 17:6 is a very popular aspect ratio for panoramas, but you can pretty much shoot in any aspect ratio that you want. You can either use a really wide angle lens and crop the photograph into a panorama aspect ratio, you can take a series of photos and stitch them together afterwards, or you can use the panorama function on your camera. I prefer using the second technique as you get a much higher resolution and much more detail in your photograph. The Milky Way has a season. Depending on where you are on the planet, it starts around about March, April time, and it goes right through until about September, October time, maybe a little bit later. You can use an app like PhotoPills or Planet Pro to work out where the Milky Way is going to be in the sky in your location. Earlier in the season, it lies relatively flat in the sky, and through the night it will move into a more vertical position, whereas later in the season, around September to October, it will already be vertical in the sky as it gets dark enough to see. So I've found that earlier in the year, say from March right through to June, July time, that's the best time to get an astrophotography panorama. There's a certain way that you set up your camera to get a successful panorama. And also there are a few bits of kit that can help. They're not essential, but they make the job a lot easier, especially when doing an astrophotography panorama. To take a panorama at night, it can be really tricky because sometimes the frame is really dark and you don't have a point of reference, even when using bright monitoring. Whenever you do a panorama, you want to make sure that you have lots of overlap, so the computer doesn't have any trouble in stitching the images together. Some tripod heads have the angle of turn measured around the base of the tripod head. This is really good, and it means that you can just turn it by a certain set degree. If yours has this, all you need to do is make sure you turn no more than 15 degrees between each shot, or you can buy one of these panorama adapters. But if you don't have either, you can wing it, and there's a way to do that as well. I tend to use a 25mm for my panoramas. If you have a kit lens or you have something at 24mm like the Sony 24mm 1.4, this will be really good as well. When you start dropping below 20mm, if you have a budget lens, you'll start getting quite a lot of distortion, and this will make it a little bit trickier for the computer to stitch the images together successfully afterwards. I have a panorama adapter because my tripod head is pretty rubbish. It basically has a way of marking different angles with a click. This is great at night as I can feel when the camera is in the right place instead of having to use my torch between each shot. It is around $30 to $40, so it shouldn't break the bank. If you're interested in getting one of these adapters, there's a link in the description below. Set up your tripod and make sure it's level. Most tripods come with a bubble level built in, so just make sure this is in the center. Put your camera in the portrait orientation. Work out where you're going to start and end the panorama, and turn your camera to the start point. Turn the camera to manual and then dial in your settings. This would be the same as when you were taking a single astrophotography image. If you're not sure how to do this, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description to my astrophotography tutorial. Basically, everything has to be on manual, so the settings don't change at all between photos. And this includes focusing. So everything on manual. When framing up your shot, as well as making sure the tripod is level, make sure the horizon is level by using the built-in level in your camera. If you don't have this, you can use a bubble float. This will ensure that your horizon stays level throughout the panorama. Then start taking each shot. If you don't have a way of measuring the angle of turn, turn on bright monitoring or live view and use the stars that you can see in your frame as a reference. Just make sure that each star you can see appears in at least 2 frames. If you have a tripod head that measures the angle of turn, set this to 15 degrees between each shot. With a 25mm, you'll have plenty of overlap. Also, make sure you have plenty of space above the top of the Milky Way. This is so that it doesn't get cropped when you stitch them together. If the Milky Way is too low in the sky, you won't get much of an arc in the shot. If it's too high in the sky, you'll start to lose the top of it in the middle of the panorama. You can do a second line of photographs, but then Lightroom might have trouble stitching them together, and you might need a more advanced program like PTGUI Pro, which is a dedicated panorama program. Once you've finished your panorama, then it's time to head home and stitch them together. I'm going to be editing them in Lightroom, but if you use a different editing software, I'm sure the process is very similar. If you'd like to try Lightroom, I've left a link in the description, and this will give you a free trial. First of all, bring your photos into Lightroom. If you're not sure how to do this, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. Find your panorama shots, and then switch to the Develop module. Once you've found your panorama images, select them all. Enable lens profile correction. This will basically reduce any distortion that the lens might produce. I then remove any Lightroom sharpening. I'll then make a few corrections, but only a slight amount. I don't want to do any heavy editing yet. I'm going to do that afterwards when I've built the panorama. Once you've made all of the changes you want to on that one image, make sure all of the images in the panorama are selected. Click on Sync, check all, and synchronize. This will make sure that all the changes that you made are the same throughout the whole of the panorama. Again, making sure that all of your panorama images are selected, right-click on them, go to Photo Merge and Panorama. It'll then open up the Panorama Merge preview. You then have a few different projections. I tend to keep it on spherical or cylindrical. Perspective tends to work more for architectural photography. You also have this boundary warp slider. You can slide this one way or the other and it'll change the look of the image. Just make sure that the horizon is nice and flat. I check auto crop and I keep auto settings unchecked. And then I click on merge. Once your computer has stitched the panorama together successfully, then it's time to do the rest of your editing. One thing I've found is if I do too much editing before stitching the images together, it sometimes starts to show the boundaries between each of the images, and this is the last thing that you want. Just make sure you only do small changes before stitching the pano together, and then the rest of your editing once it has been merged. And that's about it. This is a fun addition to astrophotography, and it can really open up the shots that you can create at night. Just start with a 24 or a 25mm, and then work your way around that. See if you can build a panorama with a 50mm, then see if you can build one with a wider lens. The only way that you're really going to learn how to do this and how your kit performs is to go out there and do it. So next time you're under a starry sky, try this technique and see if you can create an astrophotography panorama. And one other benefit to learning this technique is if your widest lens is 24mm, then you can start shooting much wider shots and get more of the Milky Way in your photographs. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you next time.